My name is Kelly, and 5 years ago I met a man who completely changed my life. His name was Tom. Charming, self-assured, and everything I thought I wanted. When he told me about his son John, I took the news calmly. John was 17 at the time, and I made it clear right away that I wasn't interested in taking on a stepmother role. It was an honest discussion, and Tom agreed. John stayed with his mother, which worked well for everyone. Life settled into a comfortable routine, just the two of us. I cherished our quiet, cozy evenings together and the simplicity of our little world. But a few months ago, things began to shift. Now an adult, John started visiting our home more frequently. At first, his appearances were tied to family events, easy to justify. But soon his visits became more random. He began showing up on weekdays, often when Tom was at work. While I tried not to dwell on it, his unannounced arrivals left me with an unsettling feeling. One evening stands out in my memory. I was preparing a romantic dinner for Tom. The air was filled with the scent of fresh herbs and roasted meat, and soft candlelight reflected off the glass-topped table. It was meant to be an intimate moment just for us. Lost in thought, I was startled when the door opened unexpectedly. My heart leapt. I assumed it was Tom. But instead, it was John. He stood in the doorway, tall and composed, with that familiar, intense stare I had noticed more than once before. His unexpected arrival threw me off, but I simply nodded in acknowledgement, masking my surprise, and resumed chopping vegetables. John sat silently at the kitchen table, his hands clasped in front of him as though he was gearing up to say something. The tension in the air was almost tangible, heavy like the stillness before a storm. I caught him glancing at me occasionally, his gaze darting away when our eyes met. There was something in those fleeting looks that I couldn't quite define, something that made me uneasy. I tried to focus on my cooking, but his silence felt almost oppressive. Finally, he exhaled deeply, as if summoning courage, but no words came out. Instead, he abruptly stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked into the living room without a word. Left alone, I felt a weight settle in my chest. What was that? I couldn't decipher his behavior, torn between irritation and worry. Was it simply youthful awkwardness, or did he want to say something important but couldn't find the words? I took the dinner out of the oven, trying to collect my thoughts, but the unease lingered. Eventually, I went into the living room. John was slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone. His posture was tense, his jaw tight, and he didn't lift his head when I entered, though I could tell he was aware of my presence. His silence made me even more anxious. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I address it directly or leave him be? The days that followed were thick with unspoken tension. John continued to visit, but something had changed. He avoided looking at me directly, and his movements were stiff and cautious. I, too, kept my distance, trying to avoid being alone with him. Yet, despite my efforts, I felt his presence acutely, as though he were always nearby, even when he wasn't. I found myself listening for his footsteps or glancing at the door, anticipating his arrival. That invisible barrier between us grew stronger, and the memory of that night lingered, his intense gaze and hesitant demeanor etched into my mind. A week later, a quiet knock at the bedroom door startled me, sending a chill down my spine. My heart raced as I opened the door to find John standing there. His face was a mixture of determination and inner conflict. He hesitated, taking a deep breath before speaking. As his words came, they were slow and heavy, like water struggling to flow through a blocked dam. He seemed lost, caught in his own thoughts as he tried to explain himself. Though I told myself there was nothing to worry about, the uneasiness clung to me. Silence hung over the house like a dense fog, smothering everything. The evenings dragged on endlessly, filled with a strange, suffocating stillness. John would sit in the living room, glued to his phone, his figure barely visible in the dim light, as though he were frozen in time. It added to the surreal atmosphere, and I could no longer bear my indecision. Finally, I stepped into the living room, my frustration spilling over. Raising my voice slightly, I blurted, "John, what's going on? Is there something you want to say?" He flinched as if my words had jolted him from another world. Slowly, he lifted his head, his expression a mix of embarrassment and confusion. The silence dragged on until he whispered, almost inaudibly, "Yes." Did Teach me? I've never tried." His voice wavered and he lowered his head, his cheeks flushing as though he was ashamed of what he'd just said. For a moment I froze. Emotions boiled inside me, confusion, anxiety, anger. It felt impossible to pretend nothing was happening anymore. Yet, instead of snapping out of it, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of an abyss, one that begged me to make sense of the situation. "Teach you what?" I asked, my voice sharper than intended, but I needed clarity. John abruptly stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Forget it, it's nothing." "I'm sorry," he muttered, heading for the door without meeting my gaze. But I wasn't about to let him leave like that. "John, stop," I said firmly. He halted in the doorway, his back to me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "If you want to talk, then talk. Don't walk away." He stood there, unmoving, as though battling himself. His back was rigid, his entire body tense like a drawn bowstring. That conversation left the house feeling like anything but a sanctuary. It no longer felt like the safe, peaceful haven it once had been. Every sound and every step echoed relentlessly in my mind. We barely spoke, but the silence between us took on a life of its own, haunting and unbearable. It hung heavy, like a live wire threatening to snap at any moment. Even when John wasn't in the same room, his presence lingered. It felt as though I was being watched, studied, like a character in someone else's story. One evening, when Tom hadn't yet returned from work, I arrived home later than usual. An unsettling quiet blanketed the house, suffocating in its stillness. I walked into the kitchen and saw John sitting there, absorbed in his phone. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and there was something in his eyes, a depth that felt like a pool I could fall into. I stopped in the doorway, trying to make sense of the feeling clawing at me. Was it fear? Regret? I couldn't tell, but I knew that tonight would not follow the usual script. "Are you still here?" I asked, my voice tinged with irritation. Slowly he rose from the table, his gaze never leaving mine. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he moved, and suddenly the space between us felt far too small. "I've been wanting to talk," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. A chill ran up my spine. "Then start," I replied, attempting to keep my tone calm, though my heart was hammering in my chest. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and uneven, but his words hit me harder than a shout. He confessed feelings he couldn't understand, admitting that our interactions had pushed him to the brink of something he couldn't explain. He said he'd always admired me, but now that admiration had turned into something else. As I listened, I felt disbelief rising in me, yet his words had a dangerous pull, slipping beneath my defenses. They made me forget the boundaries I knew I needed to maintain. "This is wrong," I whispered, trying to steady myself. "You're confused." But his eyes burned with an intensity that made my breath catch, and his voice trembled as he replied, "I might be confused, but this is real." His words hung in the air like a weight, and suddenly the room felt unbearably small. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Without another word, I turned and walked away, my thoughts swirling like leaves in a storm. The sound of rain against the window created a haunting, discordant melody, adding to the disorientation. I sat on the edge of the couch, desperately trying to piece together some sense of logic. I knew then that life as I knew it had irrevocably changed. Tom's absence felt like a gaping void, his parting instructions ringing in my ears. "Help him, teach him how to feel better." Those words hit me like a hammer, growing heavier with each repetition in my mind. The next morning offered no clarity, only a fresh wave of confusion. When the doorbell rang, I hesitated before answering, dread knotting in my stomach. John stood on the doorstep, holding a bouquet of lilies. His gaze was intense, yet there was a pleading quality to it. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Numbly, I nodded, though my pulse raced with unease. He stepped inside, carefully placing the flowers on the table before standing directly in front of me. I didn't know where to look, where to put my hands, or how to escape the piercing weight of his gaze. I wanted to talk," he began, struggling with his words. "I need to understand what's happening to me. Can you help me?" His hand reached out, brushing mine tentatively. The touch was gentle but carried an intensity that unsettled me. I instinctively pulled my hand back, but he didn't retreat. His expression sharpened as he said, "You need to listen to me. I don't know how to deal with this. These feelings are new, and I can't control them." My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of questions. Why are you here? Why are you saying this? Why does your father approve of this? As if reading my mind, he spoke quietly. "I talked to my father. He said you could help me understand. That it would be okay." His words shattered the thin thread of composure I had left. My legs felt weak, my mind scattered, and a single thought screamed through my head. Run. Get away from this. But I didn't move. Instead, I stood frozen as John leaned closer, his fingers grazing my arm with newfound confidence. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence so thick I could hear my heart beat. "You want to help me, don't you? You won't leave me," he whispered, his voice almost pleading. "This is wrong, John," I finally said, my voice trembling. "Do you realize what you're saying?" He looked down, his tone heavy as he replied, "I know, but I can't help it." When he looked back at me, his gaze was a mixture of longing and vulnerability, laced with something more, a desire that sent a chill through me. It was a look I recognized but never expected to see from him. My heart felt like it was breaking. I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against the edge of the table. John didn't move, but his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I took a sharp breath and said, "You need to leave. Now." He stood motionless as though my words hadn't registered. Then, as if obeying an unseen command, he slowly picked up the bouquet and extended it toward me. "I just wanted you to know how important you are to me," he said quietly. My instincts screamed not to take the flowers, but my hands moved of their own accord. As I accepted them, I forced myself to repeat, "John, please leave," but he didn't listen. Instead, he took my hands, guiding me toward the table. His touch sent my mind into chaos, and when his hand brushed my face and his fingers traced my lips, I felt myself spiraling. He leaned in close, whispering promises in my ear, his words tinged with both restraint and yearning. Just as he began to pull at my robe, his jaw tightened, and I could see the internal battle written across his face. Summoning what strength I had left, I pushed him back with my foot. He stepped away, nodding slightly as though realizing he'd gone too far. But before he left, he did something that left me reeling. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. A brief, almost innocent gesture that burned into me like a brand. When the door clicked shut behind him, I collapsed onto the couch, wrapping my arms around my head. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I whispered to myself, hoping this was just a nightmare I'd soon wake from, but deep down I knew it was real. And it was only the beginning.